Japan by River Cruise is made possible thanks to those who donate to the show at japanbyrivercruise.com and due to the generosity of our corporate and otherwise sponsors. This week we have a message from Bobby's Blend.
Has this ever happened to you?
Ho hum. I'm constantly asking for money to help support my podcast and occasionally mental health charities. But now I want to ask for money for something else.
If this is currently happening to you, you're Bobby Judo. Bobby, what do you want money for now?
Thanks, Ollie. This time, I'd actually like to offer the listeners the exciting business opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a brand new business opportunity that's opportune for business. No, just kidding. I wanted to announce that I am finally launching a crowdfunding page for a, no lie, riverside barbecue terrace out in the mountains in Karatsu, complete with barbecue spaces to rent to cook on your own, or the option to buy American-style grilled burgers, ribs, barbecue chicken, etc., as well as my own line of original sauces and spices.
Well, the fact that this is a riverside venture means that I have a prima facie legal claim for a portion of business revenue.
Yes, your portion will be entirely paid in pork.
That's what I was looking for.
I have a crowdfunding page on Campfire. You can find out there how to donate in return for a lot of things. Things like a box of products, an invitation to the opening party, a private cooking lesson, stickers, a day's use of a barbecue site, a night in our attached guest room, and so much more.
Presumably there's a stretch goal with a night in your actual bedroom as well.
Oh, yeah. If somebody would pay me for it for a change, that'd be great. But the Campfire platform, unfortunately, it's only available for people who are in Japan. If you're not in Japan and you would like to contribute, please contact me directly via Twitter, Facebook, or my new barbecue brand dedicated Instagram account, which is Bobby's_blend. This crowdfunding project is all in, which means we're doing it no matter how much we collect, but every yen collected means we can make it that much better. By which I mean the facility, not the food. The food quality should be independent of how much you donate. But all links are in the show notes and plastered all over my social media as of today, so please do check it out. Thank you! Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
Yeah, welcome back. I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Pernille Rudlin, a consultant who specializes in providing training for Japanese companies doing business in Europe. Currently, she's removed the River Wensum acclimation cruise from her training regimen, as thanks to current government policies and a Brexit-induced chemical shortage, it's full of poo. Pernille, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
On this week's show, the post-Brexit UK-Japan trade agreement was touted as a British-shaped deal that goes substantially farther than the existing European one. But it's been a year now, and we've discovered the same thing we discovered when we dated that French exchange student back in high school. The European ones go farther. We'll get Pernille's take on what that trade deal was meant to accomplish and how it's played out. Plus, Ollie's got your weekly River Cruise recommendation. Ollie?
Yes, Bobby, later in the show I will be recommending an overnight historical reenactment river cruise where, despite being on a historical narrowboat, guests are offered a modern-day luxury of a queen-sized bed. I tried it, but forgot that in the 1800s, people were way smaller then, and the queens were like the size of children, so you're sleeping in a cot.
Also, when asked about concerns about the effects of global warming on the Japanese river cruise industry, Aso Taro suggested this week that one positive effect of increasingly hot conditions could be that people will be happy about getting to cool down in the water when the boats sink. We'll talk more about that later, but first, Soap Talk. Brian, did you enjoy your week off from the podcast?
No, and stop asking.
Pernille, it's great to be back with a British guest supporting British values as we enjoy the huge success that our country is currently enjoying post-Brexit.
Thank you. Except I'm not very British, really. I'm a bit Danish as well. In fact, I wish I was more Danish and had a Danish passport sometime.
Well, yes, and I understand that you spent some of your childhood living in Japan. Is that right?
Yeah, I used to joke that I was a third Japanese because I'd spent a third of my life living there, but now I'm rather old.
Me too.
That's not the case. But yeah, I first of all lived up in Sendai when I was a little girl. and went to a Shirayuri Shogakko, which was one of those very traditional Japanese all-girls schools with a sailor and a sailor uniform and a hat and one of those really heavy leather randoseru rucksack things.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was probably the first non-Japanese person to go to that school, so I had to learn Japanese really fast to survive.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
And now you're back in the UK in the home of Alan Partridge. That's how many of our listeners will know where you live. Norwich, is that right?
That's right. It's about the only damn thing that Norwich is famous for. But we've just decided to roll with it. There's even a pub called the Owl Sanctuary.
Is there?
After Alan Partridge's joke about, cracking owl sanctuary.
Do Japanese people have any chance of getting why Alan Partridge is funny? Because it's a style of humour that I genuinely don't think exists in Japan.
Do they know who he is? I mean, I'm familiar with the name, but if you asked me to pick him out of a lineup, I probably couldn't.
Yeah, I doubt it. I mean, Steve Coogan, the actor.
Oh, I know that
I
one.
don't know if he's done anything else that has hit Japan. I doubt it. But, I remember when I was living in Japan the third time round, just being so surprised that Japanese people were renting out Monty Python
Yeah.
videos.
Oh, yeah.
And thinking, why would that make any sense? And I often say to people in my training sessions, actually, that I think one thing that the Japanese and the British certainly share is a sense of humour that's more around a sense of the absurd and the ridiculous.
Anything that's...
And sort of self-deprecation and just making a bit of an idiot of yourself.
Yeah.
That all translates very well.
Visually identifiable silliness is very easy to understand across cultural boundaries.
Yeah. And despite living in Norwich, do you still manage to get a taste of Japan?
Actually, Norwich that's one of the sort of hidden secrets I think about Norwich, is that we have excellent restaurants here of all shades. And just opposite my house, it's not the reason I moved here, but just opposite my house is a genuinely Japanese-run restaurant that does sort of sushi and tonkatsu and all those.
Not a Ringer Hut, then?
Not a Ringer Hut, no. So you're mentioning that because of our other Japan connection, then?
You guys have a connection to Ringer Hut?
Yeah, bizarre.
I could walk to one in 5 minutes.
And what? Yeah. Well, anyway, yes. The connection is. I just discovered this recently because I was working with somebody from the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Art and Cultures on these Japan connections, and he said to me, "Well, of course, Frederick Ringer was born in Norwich," and I said, "Who he?" And he said, "He's the British merchant that set up in Nagasaki in the 1860s." And the Ringer Hut Champon noodle restaurants are named after him.
What?
And so I started to do a sort of search on this and found out that indeed the founders of Ringer Hut visited Norwich and went to his grave and paid their respects.
No way.
So
Very sweet.
all Ringer Huts are built in kind of like this same franchise construction where there's a bell tower on top of the building. And I'd always assumed that they were called Ringer Hut because of ringing the bell.
Yeah,
Clearly not.
That makes sense.
But there was a dude named Frederick Ringer who was in Nagasaki.
Around the same time as Thomas Glover, and in fact had a house next door to Thomas Glover's famous house, and it's still there.
Man, I always love hearing these stories of like the OG gaijin, but because they fall like they set the standard for the rest of us, right? They try their hand at dating the foreign women and don't get very good at the language and like still have to smuggle in British food because
That's funny. It's weird that there's no English influence in the menu of Ringer Hut because it all serves very traditional kind of like Japanese arrangements of Chinese food and things like that. But now that I think about it, last time I was there, they do ask you how you like your food prepared, and one of the options was bland. So maybe that's the...
Oi, stop it. Yeah, it's true. Well, I mean, just a couple of things on that. First of all, Frederick Ringer was quite an interesting character in contrast to some of the other gaijin, OGs as you call them. He was more of the school of do not fraternize with the natives. So he married another gaijin woman and insisted that they continue their British lifestyle. But the servants and the employees of Home Ringer, as his company was called, should all continue to wear Japanese clothing and shouldn't wear Western clothing. So he was quite hard line.
kind of the equivalent of like the ugly American. You know, like you go to as a military or diplomatic position, you
just
go to
keep
another
shopping
country
at
and
at the What's It store and just eat peanut butter all the time. Yeah, a bit like that. I think it was also a moral sense to it because Norwich is quite a kind of heavy, kind of non-conformist tradition, and he certainly came out of that. He was a non-conformist, and so I think he almost felt it was kind of morally wrong to have Japanese mistresses like all the other people were, like Thomas Glover, and that was somehow not pure and nice. And it was actually weirdly almost out of respect for Japan too, that Japan, the culture should not be contaminated by filthy foreign ways.
Well, speaking of filthy foreigners and morally questionable people, you've worked extensively with Rochelle Kopp, who we love. She's our most frequent traveler on the Japan by River Cruise podcast here. What's it like to work with her personally?
Well, actually, we go back a long, long way. When the internet was still a new thing, we actually wrote a book together, just by email. And so I never actually met her physically. Although the reason she tracked me down, or we tracked her down, was that I used to belong, when I was in Japan in the early 90s, to a thing, I don't know if it's still around, called the Kaisha Society, which was for foreigners working in Japanese companies in Tokyo. And she'd been a member as well, but I think just before me or something. And we used to do these surveys every year of foreigners in Japanese companies, what they were being paid, what kind of benefits they got, that kind of thing. And that was when she got her idea to write the book that kicked it all off, The Rice Paper Ceiling. So she contacted the Kaisha Society and said, could I have some of your latest surveys? And we said, yes, but how about writing a book together?
Oh,
so
wow.
So it was that we sort of all wrote different chapters of that book, and it got published by Jetro Books way back in the day. Called Kaisha Naka no Gaikokujin, so the foreigners inside the Japanese company. It was kind of aimed at confused kacho team leaders who were like, what the hell is this foreigner doing on my team? Why do they want to work here?
How do I deal with them? How do I interact and communicate?
How do I deal with them? Why are they here anyway? Because there was I don't know if that's still the case for people living in Japan who are foreign. It's like
every foreigner who lives in Japan gets asked, why are you here?
What's wrong with your own country? Almost,
We don't have any ringer huts.
Yeah, exactly. So that was how it started, and then I sort of vaguely kept in touch with her over the years. But then when basically I got made redundant, lost my job, I joined an IT company after my long time at Mitsubishi Corporation, and like a lot of IT companies in the 2000s, it went bust because it spent lots of money very stupidly. And I started doing various consulting work and got in touch with her because I realized she'd started up Japan Intercultural Consulting. And I realized that what I was doing in the UK was a bit similar, except in the UK rather than in America. And she said, well, great timing. Actually, some of my clients are asking for the European version of this. So we still hadn't met face to face at this point. But I think finally she came over to the UK to meet me. And I think I also then met her once when I had a business trip over to California when she was still living on the West Coast. And then I think most recently we met about 2 years ago when I took my son to Japan for the first time. And
fine. You've met her a few times, but what's the dirt?
There is no dirt.
Anyway, we need to. We've got some backdated gratitude, Bobby, because we didn't have an episode last week for very understandable reasons. If you're us, so should we not rattle through, but do them fairly quickly?
Well, the last regularly scheduled show that we'd mentioned that we hadn't had any new memberships or any donations in a little while, and now we've got this huge influx of coffee donations and new memberships, starting with Brian in Fukuoka, who bought us 5 coffees and said, you don't have to beg, which you say that, but clearly the facts do not agree with your assertion.
we had to beg. We had an anonymous 3 coffees. We had Fjolnir. Bobby, do you want to try that one? Fjolnir. F-J-O with a couple of dots on it. L-N-I-R. Please get in touch with the katakana spelling of that and we'll get it right next time. We also need to say thank you to Kevin, who bought us some coffees. We need to say thank you to Clayton. we need to say thank you to AK and Oleg, who became a member, who gets access to all the bonus bits. Thank you very much, everybody. And Bobby, did we get any mails this week?
Yes, we got an email from a Brian in Fukuoka named Pat, who's in the US, and he said, "Hey guys, I'm trying to give you more money, but Buy Me a Coffee's being weird and not going through. Is that on your end or mine?" We assume it's on yours. What you can do is try again with 3 times the amount of money and see if that goes through. He also wants to know, Ali, when are you doing a US tour?
Oh, that's a nice question to ask. I don't know when I'm going to get back out to the US. I'd love to. I very happily did some shows in New York and San Francisco when I was there a couple of years ago. I know that visa requirements have got a lot harder under Trump, and they haven't been relaxed yet. And also, the last gig I did in the US was that horrific one at the Apple Store, which we've talked about on the show before. And I'm still not fully recovered from that. Anyway, Bobby, shall we jump into the news? Bobby, do you know what's in the news this week?
Well, it's been a year since the UK touted their Japan trade agreement as a feather in the Brexit cap, largely because they said it would do more for England than an EU-Japan trade deal would. Pernille, how do you think that position holds up today?
It holds up no more nor less than it did a year ago, which is not really, basically.
Well, that's the answer that we guessed you'd give. Let's dig in a bit deeper. This stems from a spat between Emily Thornberry, who wears a red hat, and Liz Truss, who wears a blue hat. And the person that wears the red hat is the good guy. The person that wears the blue hat is the bad guy. And
that's the opposite from the States.
Is it?
Yeah, the red hats are evil and the blue hats are slightly less evil.
Well, anyway, Emily Thornberry has taken Liz Truss to task, basically saying, is there a quantifiable difference between the EU-Japan trade deal and the new, quote-unquote, new UK-Japan trade deal? In order to answer that question, we're going to ask a preliminary question, which is, what is a trade deal?
Well, it could be anything you want it to be, really. It can cover a huge variety of things. But of course, as we've discovered, people tend to focus most of all on the whole area of tariffs, which is sort of how much tax has to be put on goods that are brought in from another country. But it can also cover areas like government procurement. It can cover intellectual property, liberalisation. So it's a chance to try and sort of get the other people to liberalise their regulations a bit more. All sorts of things can get covered. But yes, it usually seems to end up about cheese.
So what was this trade deal? What was this UK-Japan trade deal that they put in place a year ago?
From sort of the past, 30 years would it be? More than that, 40 years of the UK being in the EU. Most trade negotiation was done through the EU, unsurprisingly. So all those deals, including the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, of course ceased to apply once the UK had left the EU on January of. So Liz Truss and her team were put under immense pressure, and I guess you have to sort of give her some credit for that, to do what they called roll over as many of the pre-existing EU plus X type deals as they could. And one of the very first ones to get sort of rolled over was the EU-Japan one.
As anyone who's ever been with Ali will attest, it's pretty hard to roll over when you're under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, so there was a lot of accusations that this is all just cut and paste, but Liz Truss, who by the way was a Remainer, had been in favour of staying in the EU apparently, although I think she's most in favour of Liz Truss. It's really fundamentally her motivation. So she's now become this sort of kind of big cheerleader for these aren't just rollovers. There's some British benefit. Brexit is wonderful kind of approach. And I think she forces, and that's why we keep getting these spats on Twitter, because these poor civil servants that run the Department for Trade's Twitter account have to keep putting out these sort of cheaper soya sauce, and
I'm so with you. I don't know why they bother, because as we know, Twitter's not read by the country. It's read by the political class, journalists, and busybodies. I don't know why they just don't bother just deleting their Twitter account and not even engaging with these spats, because they know they're going to be taken to task.
I think it's trolling, basically. I think she does it deliberately to wind people up, like me.
Well, let's talk about the issues, because what this trade deal was actually about. Like, where it did go further than the EU was, say, for example, on digital trade and on data rights, because the EU is very, very protectionist about how data can be moved. We all know about GDPR. That's got an influence so strong that even American companies have to take it seriously. And, you know, Japan wanted more data sharing, and, you know, that was good for the digital economy. All that stuff, in theory, like, that's really, if you care about these kind of issues, that could be a kind of a flag flying, you know, the UK is a service economy. We can sell our software to Japan. Japan can sell its software back. You know, we might not have manufacturing plants, but we can have the robots that generate blah, 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 right? But what this has actually come down to is absolutely mad spats, as you said, about protected origins, right? So, like, are you allowed to call black pudding? Are you allowed to call Scotch beef? Or you know, a certain type of cheese? Because, and my guess is, these are the stories which journalists like writing about because you can accompany them with an image that people click on.
Absolutely. And there's something vaguely humorous about it as well, isn't there? Storn away black pudding, you know, it's sort of... you can just imagine Boris Johnson finding some alliterative way of talking about it, can't you? Yeah.
Right. And does this mean,
just for someone who has no idea what Stornoway black pudding is, we're talking about kind of things like, you know, if it's not from the Champagne region,
Exactly.
it's not Champagne.
I mean, that's
we're
where it all
talking
started off, isn't it? It's the bloody French, isn't it? They were the ones that started all of this with their appellation d'origine contrôlée and all that. And indeed, yes, I mean, you can see their point. They were getting very fed up with people claiming that any old horrible sparkling white wine was champagne. And they said, no, champagne comes from the Champagne region. And that's what kicked it all off.
So in this trade deal, Japan promised the UK that they would give them more naming rights or origin rights for certain products?
So, I mean, that's the bizarre bit of it, isn't it? Which is, I actually went and had a look at Japan's geographic indicators. And there's over 100 of them that Japan has, and you can just imagine, of course, Japan would love that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah. I mean, they register their shochus and things like that.
Water clams are protected. You know, they must only come from Lake Ogawara. But you have to think, well, is anyone about to fake Lake Ogawara brackish water clams? Are the Chinese busily trying to export brackish water clams to the UK, claiming that they're from Lake Ogawara when they're not? And would anyone in the UK care anyway? No.
Obviously, I'm sure there are certain things like Scotch whiskey, for example, where I'm sure the Scottish would be happier that you can't just say Scotch whiskey to describe any old whiskey. I'm sure there are, you know, there are certain ones where, you know, it matters. But what seems to
Japan too, they do that with shochus and sakes and things like that. It doesn't come from a certain region. It doesn't.
Yeah. But it seems that the kind of issues which people are talking about, such as, you know, this black pudding, if it has any effect on trade, it would be like rounding error level numbers.
Yeah, and the worst thing really about that deal, I remember a year ago when I spotted this going, oh God, this is just... Because, I mean, first of all, you already made, Bobby, that joke about British bland food, and actually I have to say that one of the comments that Japanese always make...
First comedian ever to make a joke about British food being bland, by the way. I want the credit.
Yeah.
First one
Obviously,
ever.
You've never tried German or Dutch food, but anyway. Sorry. But I mean, I think one thing you can say for sure is that British food's actually got a lot better, well, certainly in the cities. I mean, you can still eat disgusting British food if you really want to, but of course, one of the reasons that it's got a lot better is that we've got a lot of foreign people cooking foreign food here.
Well, exactly. It's not our food anymore.
Although Norwich has some really fine British food restaurants too, and we are becoming a lot more Japanese in that way, thinking about the origin of something and what's the best season to eat it in, and so on. So great, and I think from that point of view, the geographic indicators thing's been actually a very good thing because it makes people a bit more aware of where the food comes from and what the best producers of it are.
Sure, and I guess the opposite is true too, that this trade deal would allow British food to be sold to Japan more cheaply with lower tariffs? Like, does this mean that there's going to be a day where British expats don't need to come to Japan with suitcases full of Bisto gravy powder, Marmite, baked beans, and antiperspirant? That's a night out, by the way.
Yeah, my suitcase when I went back to Japan to see my parents contained paracetamols, Earl Grey tea, and size 11 socks.
Everyone needs a hobby.
But the thing that was, I think, the most irritating about the way this deal was sold, and you have to say in a way it actually made it worse than what we had with the EU, was that another thing that trade deals often contain are quotas. And so there were quotas agreed between the EU and Japan on things like cheese. And, immediately, of course, Twitter goes into a whole thing about, well, what's the point? Because all Japanese are lactose intolerant anyway, which is sort of true and sort of not true if you kind of go into the research on that. But when the UK negotiated their new deal with Japan, all they were really allowed to have was whatever was left over from the imports into Japan of EU cheeses. Yeah, so can you imagine yourself? You are, Mr. Tanaka, cheese importer in Japan. And what you have to do if you want to import British Stilton or whatever the other geographically protected Wensleydale, etc. are, what you would have done in the past would have been to consolidate a whole load of cheeses from Europe into one shipment, because that just makes more sense cost-wise.
Imagine that box stinks.
But now what you'd have to do is first of all, you're going to have problems consolidating because the UK is no longer in the EU. And secondly, you'd have to pay tariffs on that British cheese initially. And then if there was any quota left over at the end of the year, you can then claim the tariffs back.
Right.
So if you're Mr. or Mrs. Tanaka, can you be bothered to do that?
Yeah, of
because
course.
I mean, generally,
Yeah,
Japanese people would think good cheeses aren't actually British cheeses. Unfortunately, they'll be thinking more about French cheeses and Italian cheeses, won't they? If they think about cheese at all.
Let me ask a very blunt question. Were the Japanese bothered to do that? By which I mean, was there pressure put on the Japanese to make a trade deal with the UK so that the UK could use this as a PR thing for Brexit?
Absolutely, and of course the leverage from the Japanese perspective, what they were very keen to get sorted out was the whole automotive parts bit. That was the thing that they were most worried about. And
because of the fact that the just-in-time supply chain was overnight obliterated.
Yes, exactly. And all sorts of... If tariffs had been put on parts coming into the UK for Toyota or Honda or Nissan, it would have caused an awful lot of problems.
And in terms of the stuff that, in terms of this trade deal, resonates with the public, the things like the geographical origins, the naming rights and things like that, one of the big things that the government touted in the UK as a feather in the cap was that this was going to give them more rights than an EU-Japan deal would have. Has that been the case?
Exactly as Ollie said. I think the only thing that you can really say was a plus was the whole bit around data and algorithms. And
have we tried making cheese from data? Hey, thanks very much for listening to this episode 105 of Japan by River Cruise. It's great to be back.
Yeah, had a great show this week. Thanks to our guest, Pernille Rudlin. Pernille, if our guests would like to find more from you, where can they look?
Well, I'm either around on Japan Intercultural or else I also discuss UK, Japan and trade and investment and so on my Pernille Rudlin Twitter account and also my blog on Rudlin Consulting.
All right, we'll check those out. Thank you again, and thank you to everybody for listening. We will see you next week.